next week.
Good afternoon. We will call the November Diversion Authority Finance Committee to order. And the first item is 1A, roll call.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Here.
Mr. Costin? Ms. Johnson? Yep. Ms. McCall?
Here.
Mr. Jacobson?
Here.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Here.
Mr. Steen?
Here.
Mr. Gehrig? Mr. Redlinger?
Here.
Dr. Mahoney?
Here.
Mr. Grimberg?
Here. Quorum declared. Next, approval of the minutes from the previous meeting. Is there a motion?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed,
Aye.
same sign. Motion carries. Mike, are you going to take 3 and 4, I believe?
Sure. The bills are, summary of the bills is listed on 6, and then the bills are following that. It's a total of $2,557,869.69. The majority of those bills have to do with land purchases through the Water Resource District. Move to approve.
Second.
Discussion? Hearing none, we'll take the roll.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Aye.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney?
Aye.
Mr. Grimberg?
Aye. Item 4?
Sure, on
Yeah.
page 16, you kind of have the summary of what we've spent to date, 508,492,384, with income of almost $600 million. If you go to the next page, you'll see we have a balance right now of about $91 million on hand. Most of that, of course, being sales tax money. On the next page, you'll see our budget, the approved budget for 2019, and then the received and expended to date. On the bottom, you'll note that this year we have spent $54 million, which is 34% of our budget. If you go to the last column there, you see that with the encumbrances, we're at a negative $49 million. The encumbrances are all listed on pages 29 through 31, and a lot of those are, you know, we approve a task order, and that's listed as an encumbrance, but those monies won't be spent this year. Most of those monies won't be spent this year. That'll carry on.
Questions for Mike? Hearing none, thank you. Good.
Motion to accept?
There a motion to accept, is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll take the roll.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Aye.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney?
Aye.
Grimberg?
Aye. Thank you. Joel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll provide my executive director report to the Finance Committee now. If you can make your attention to the screen here. I'll start with the overall status. This is the level 1 summary of our estimated budget for completion. So you can see here, this is our new reporting format. You can compare the estimate at completion with the overall cost to date for all of the major elements of the project. And you can see actual expenditures to date this month are at $508 million. On the right-hand side of your screen there, forecast year 2019 for this year's annual budget, you can see the items listed there. Our budget for the year was $162 million, and as of 10/25, we're at $54.8 million. And again, the reduction in our budget tracking there is a direct result of this slowdown due to the Plan B changes. Their overall status, this is level 2 detail. This is driving down into specifics a little bit more. I'm not going to go through each one of these, and I will have this in your packet in the future for reference prior to the budget meeting. But here you can see our forecast year 2019 annual budget in relation to costs to date for more detailed information related to projects and tasks. And again, here you can see our overall status, budget in relation to actual costs to date. Program revenues, this is for the year, for the $162 million budget. This was in your packet last month. We are in the future only going to show this when we're talking about approving the annual budget, because this slide really doesn't change. This is just where all of our revenues are coming from. So in the past, we've continued to keep this slide in the packet, but it's kind of redundant. But I do think it's pertinent information for where our revenues are coming from.
Joel, I noticed the state of Minnesota, I was under the impression that there was some money that came from DNR for the state of Minnesota. Thought they had a couple. Chuck, didn't you guys have some $2 million, $8 million that came over this year?
I think so. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, I think so.
I mean, it is some millions, I think, right?
Yeah, and we're asking for it, so.
Well, yeah, and I can clarify that, Mayor Mahoney. So the city was awarded $7.5 million in grant funds from the state of Minnesota for the implementation of in-town levies within the city of Moorhead. That project hasn't expended those funds yet, and those weren't originally budgeted for in our 2019 budget. So they're not reflected in this revenue stream for the 2019 budget. But it is something as we move forward. Those were not diversion expenditure. So the city of Moorhead expended those funds, even though those funds are related to diversion project elements on the Minnesota side. And so moving into 2020, we're talking about, and we can get into that discussion a little bit more, how we track the potential Minnesota funding in relation to our entire budget, in the program budget.
Joel, that money is pretty much for Oakport, right?
Yeah, the area in between Oakport and Crystal Sugar, the North Crystal Creek subdivision area. Yeah.
I'm just saying, it's confusing when we talk to Minnesota, or North Dakota legislative people and say there's $8 million that Minnesota's putting in the project. I think they're making an assumption that's part of the $86 million that's the ask of Minnesota. So that's why I think there's some confusion, and at least, when and maybe Tony Grinberg as well, as when you talk to legislators, we said there's some money coming out already, but Joel, if it's really not to take part of what the 86 commitment is, I guess we'll have to probably clarify that, because it could be similar to Fargo, where we got in-town flood protection money, 120, and we got diversion money, which was a little different. So I just would, I guess, like clarification, if that's not going towards 86, if we're going to be asking from the state of Minnesota more money.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, that $7 million that was awarded to the city of Moorhead is included in that 86, and it is going towards diversion-related elements for in-town protection at Moorhead. Mr. Zimmerman was here, but I'm working with Mr. Zimmerman on getting correspondence that clarifies that from the city of Moorhead. The difference, and I think the point of confusion with some folks on this, is that the Minnesota dollars will not come into the diversions coffers and then be expensed back to the city of Moorhead, like the State Water Commission funds do in North Dakota. They come to the Diversion Authority. The city implements in-town flood protection projects related to the diversion project and is reimbursed through the Diversion Authority for those funds. That transaction does not take place on the Minnesota side. The money's coming directly to Moorhead and being expended by Moorhead, if that makes sense.
And that's a good point, but I think at one point when we did the financials, and I'd have to ask either John or Martin this, in some sense, I think we were building a budget assuming Minnesota wouldn't put any money in it. So it should actually be a gain for us, right? Did we always, Tony, have them for 46 million? That was always part of the financial
A
plan,
portion of it,
but not 86?
86.
Okay.
Yep, yeah.
Rick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. I understand not having to put in that page 43, you know, every time, but then I would request, if possible, I look on page 18, and we have this big revenue column, and we have nothing in the budgeted column. Can we
Sure.
fill in that column, work with Kent to get that done, so we can compare current month and where we're at year to date, and so at least we can compare back to what the estimates are on a monthly basis?
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll add that to the format as well, Mr. Steen, yes.
Thank you.
Stay on along the same topic theme. Last month, I think we had expenditures of just under 500 million, 498 if I recall.
Correct,
And now we're reporting 508 million.
correct.
And so with approval of a little over $2 million in expenditures, what's the delta between that, what we just approved and the 508 now?
So I think the main component of that, Tony, was the reimbursement to the city of Fargo for the in-town flood control projects
Okay,
last
that's
month.
correct. Okay,
I think
I got
that
it
was
now.
about 7 million total, right?
Okay, now I'm tracking, I forgot, okay.
Yep.
Funny how I forgot money coming to the city of Fargo.
That's all right. So a couple of other topics.
Second, I'm sorry, Mike.
Sorry.
Just a clarification, the bills that are approved today won't be aren't on this report. They'll be on next month's report.
Okay. The last month's too was in the same general
Same thing.
vicinity plus.
Yeah.
That was a big expense
I
last
had,
month.
I had forgotten the 7 million, so.
Yep. So that, yeah, thanks, Mike, for that clarification. A couple of other items I have in my executive director report that are new items, new business items to consider. I handed out in front of you is a letter from the Diversion Authority to the committee. The letter, if you read through it, is concerning the administrative budget for the Diversion Authority. So this currently there in 2019 forecast year budget, there is no budget for administrative expenses, no budget for salary for myself, travel expenses, operating costs, and the like. And so what I've done is I've put together an organizational structure for the Diversion Authority itself moving into forecast year 2020. And in regards to that organizational structure, I've put together salaries, benefits, as well as an operating cost budget for the Diversion Authority to sustain these new positions. So you'll see in front of you as well a handout for the organizational structure for the Diversion Authority itself. I want to make a note that the items, the boxes in blue, are Diversion Authority employees being proposed, and the administrative budget would support those employees. We can go through them a little bit. If there's any questions, I can take those at the end and explain in depth, what the scope of the different positions are. I'd like to just draw your attention to the executive director position. That's myself. Right off there to the left is an executive administrative assistant. So in the past, the Diversion Authority has used the very talented individuals from their own member entities to provide administrative support. There may be an element of that could remain in the future, but really with the addition of staff, there is a pretty glaring significant need to get some additional administrative support for that staff. So, below the executive director position is two new positions, a finance director position and an assistant executive director position. Below that is an engineering director position and a communications director position. And below the engineering director, I've identified two assistant engineering positions, one focused on Corps of Engineers portion of the project and one focused on the P3 portion of the project. With this organizational chart, I've also rearranged how some external entities are interacting with the Diversion Authority as well. And you can see the Corps of Engineers and the engineering consultants are in the red boxes. And you can see their primary points of contact under this structure. Please note the TAG group continues to be an integral part of our technical decision-making, and you can see how I've incorporated that proposal into the organizational chart. And then the program management consultant will continue to be an additional integral part of our organizational structural team, and you can see how they've been incorporated into the organizational chart as well. So before you, no action needs to be taken today, but I wanted to present this, allow a month in between here before the budget is approved in December, and take any comments that the Finance Committee may have and answer any questions that you may have concerning either the organizational chart or the proposed administrative budget for forecast year 2020.
Chad?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Joel, this is, whether this becomes reality or not, it's a good first step, if nothing else. This is what I'm hoping, and you talked a little bit about this too. This is what I was hoping was going to evolve from your position. One big question I have is, what are you using for baseline salaries? Using averages, City of Fargo, Cass, Moorhead, Clay, what's your baseline for establishing this preliminary wage and fringe benefit budget?
It's a very good question, Mr. Peterson. So I have been using industry standard rates for these positions, so they are not related or benchmarked off of City of Fargo or Cass County. I could look at that as a benchmark, but the skills and scope of some of these positions may be hard for us to find the individual with the background necessary for some of this work, for some of these positions. So that's been taken into consideration, is that there may need to be some outside candidates considered that would maybe elevate the pay scale some to more of a national search. That's probably for more of the integral positions here. Some of the positions I think are comparable to county and city positions as well. And so I've taken my best stab at market rate salary incorporated into this. And I can provide that detailed description to you. However, it's somewhat confidential what we would be paying for these positions. I don't know the best way to convey that the individual salaries for each one of those positions for to the committee.
Maybe a range
I could provide a range,
for
certainly.
each position, just so we have an idea of where it would fall into. It wouldn't have to tell us exactly what you ended up with.
I mean, with the salary and wages in my letter to the Finance Committee there, I mean, that includes my salary as well. So with 8 positions, you can divide that by 8 and kind of get an average, price per FTE. But I can provide additional information as requested.
How would this not be public? It's 100% public dollars.
It is public, and ultimately it will be, but, I just, being cognizant of the negotiation factor with hiring new employees and negotiating a salary with those individuals, do we show what we're paying for these or what we have budgeted? And when it comes to negotiations, how best to handle that. I mean, it certainly is public information, Chad, but I think whenever you're dealing with employment issues, salary issues with employers, we want to go about it in a systematic fashion until those individuals are hired. Obviously, that's all public information.
I guess I would encourage, I understand what you're saying regarding a baseline for positions that may not be comparable to anything else, but those that are comparable, I would suggest you establish, whether it's our HR department, Cass, Clay, Fargo, I frankly don't care. But make it similar on one, so we can use that for future gains as well, for future hires, future pay raises.
Sure.
And maybe now's the time we have a broader discussion, not in this meeting, but sooner rather than later, we have a broader discussion as to how we establish this as a baseline. It's a pseudo-government entity. Do we treat it like we do with MetroCog, is basically based off the City of Fargo salary rates? That's okay. But at least we have some consistency going into the future, so we all know as board members, we all know as commissioners, that we have a baseline. We will be consistent, and our predecessors and the future people will be held to the same standard we have been held to. So, and that with fringe benefits follow with that as well. You've been interacting, Mr. Redlinger, I'm presuming you've been involved in some of the discussions here or not?
No, not directly.
Okay, has Mr. Wilson, Mr. Benson been involved? All the crew, have they been included a bit?
That's correct.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful, thank you much.
And I think, just to provide comment on that, I think that's a great discussion, and that's one of the items that I was kind of questioning is, how do we go about creating a public salary policy for the diversion authority, as far as yearly step increases, all those things, we need to get those things in place with this discussion of hiring staff. So I thank you for bringing that up, because it is an item that we need to provide some level of policy around, and some sort of guidance and recommendation from Finance and Diversion Board on how we implement that, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If my memory serves me, we talked about the, obviously you're currently under the county benefits plan. Was there some discussion that at some point in time, the employees of the diversion authority actually become their own employee group, or was the plan to keep them under the county for the entirety of the project? I just can't remember what that was.
Thank you for bringing that question forward, Mr. Steen. So it's my impression that the county will continue to provide HR support through the duration of construction, and whether there's any sort of changes that occur at that point or not. I guess it's be up for consideration at that time. The benefit of having the county provide those resources is we already have an established system. We can continue to utilize county staff that are currently administrating HR benefits, and it makes sense financially. The Diversion Authority doesn't have to create an HR department and staff it and create a whole new public program for it.
Thank you. So not this has ever happened within the county, but I'm just concerned about, now we've got disproportionate compensation which relates to benefit costs that a governmental entity is going to be picking up for a quasi-governmental entity. Not that that's ever happened in the area, but
Welcome to the airport.
that's my point. So, aren't we?
You didn't need to bring us into that,
This goes
Tony.
back to Commissioner Peterson's initial question, what range are we at here? Because if we don't keep these somewhat reasonable, we're gonna cause issues within all these areas. And
Yeah.
then it just goes back down to whose employees are these type of question. So anyway, I don't want to raise it here and now, but it's, it's sitting out here in the weeds somewhere, so we have to be very careful, I think, with regard to that.
Chad?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, with that, I would really lean on our HR department. We can help you create job descriptions. We can help you create salary ranges. And in fact, we contract with a company called Fox Lawson, international salary company, or national anyway, salary company. They can help you establish baseline salaries, and you have a base of knowledge too. But right across the hall from you is a whole lot of knowledge that does this for a job. So any way they can help, that's what they're there for. Keep you focused on the bigger picture stuff and sort of the minutia. Brielle is wonderfully skilled at this too, so we have a team there to help you if you need them.
Absolutely. Yep, thank you.
Joel, I know you've thought about this a lot, but I've looked at this org chart and thought over and over and over. All the benefits that we get out of P3 project with John is I don't see any need for a financial director. I think Kent and Mike can do that. We're going to be paying checks. We're not paying individual checks. We're paying checks to a big organization. The Corps will run its own money. So I'm not sure we would need a financial director, and I'd have to have you justify that in that regard. You will never be able to hire an engineer like Bob or Nathan, and if you tell me you're going to be able to salary it up, I'm just not sure we can't do it with subcontracting the way the structure presently sits. If we continue to subcontract, then to your point, Rick, we don't get into that problem, and Jason has great knowledge, but if we're going to do the diversion, maybe when we're in construction, we might need some engineers on site to go out and do stuff, but next year, what are they going to do? I mean, Nathan and Bob should be handling, Jason should be handling the county. So when we're bringing all these people on board, my idea would be what is their purpose and what is their job? And is Jason going to quit, or is Nathan going to quit a job with the city he's got pension and benefits and everything built up for 6 years and then come back. And to Rick's point, if you pay him higher than I'm paying him, he might. I mean, if you're going to start to go out outside the bounds of the county and the city's comp packages, you might attract some people. But the reason we subcontract within the community, and if we have to do a hydrologic evaluation, we don't do that. We subcontract that outside to outside contractors that have all the robustness of their computer makeup. I would be happy to support an executive administrative assistant and an assistant executive director, but I think we would have to ponder. The state watches what we did. We already did an executive salary, which some people were objectionable to, that we're starting to add this. But if we're going to do $1 million or $2 million and start to build an organization that's going to cost a certain amount of money, I think we have to be thoughtful about that, because can we do it a different way? You know, if you're bringing in a communication director, do we need to do that or not? We've always argued that a little bit, that maybe we need somebody that's dedicated. What's wrong with the present system, or do we fix it or do other things? But what do we need next year? Maybe this is your long-term plan, but I would wonder if there's a better way of doing it without as much of robustness as a big organization you're going to start.
I thank you for those comments, Mayor Mahoney. I would agree with you on the executive administrative assistant and the executive assistant executive director. Those are absolutely needed immediately to assist in my role. The finance director, I appreciate those comments, because I think that position really does need to be justified. The intent there is not to take away what is happening with Kent Costin and Mike Montplaisir. The City of Fargo would continue to be the fiscal agent under this arrangement, I believe. But we're opening a whole new chapter with the WIFIA financing that is going to require us to implement federal regulations into our contracting. So things such as certified wages, disadvantaged business administration, American Iron and Steel, all of these different federal programs need to be met in order to access the WIFIA funding. And these items, these compliance issues, are labor intensive. And they should be done by a public agency, not a consultant, because the responsibility for the compliance is on the public agency, and we should have direct control over that. One of the tasks then of the finance director is ensuring compliance with the federal programs and making sure that all of the consultants and contractors working on the project are compliant. And so that includes monthly checks of employees, what they're getting paid, all of those different processes and procedures. Now, I can borrow a lot of what the North Dakota DOT is doing as far as compliance, because they're required to do all of those items as well. But I need staff to be able to implement the programs and monitor the programs throughout the duration of construction. That is one portion of what I view the finance director as doing, or ensuring compliance.
But I would view that with something that John and Mike and Kent can talk about, because if you ask them, that they feel that that can be covered presently. But to me, I think that's something, I understand what you're saying, Joel, but is there a way they already have set up? And if you're complying with the P3, isn't the P3 better doing that? Again, they're not, the P3 employees aren't our employees. And I don't know, John, to the federal grant, if you have for the WIFIA, if we have to check them. I mean, that part I don't know, but I'm just wondering if that, I'll put that to the side. You can have a discussion with them and figure it out with Tony, but I mean, is there a different way of doing it without hiring another party?
We'll certainly take a look at it. Another note, John will be presenting to you folks in a few minutes the flow path of money for this project, and there's many different steps in there. And so just when you're looking at that flow chart and thinking about it, there's an awful lot of areas in there that are going to require us to have additional labor in order to make things work and make the money flow, but also provide that oversight in understanding where the money is coming from, where it's going, and ensuring that compliance is met for all the different regulatory requirements necessary to access all the different funding. So we'll continue that discussion, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate those comments, though.
Chad has a question, and then I get the last word on this topic.
Mayor Mahoney, to your point, I think it's going to be the burden of our director to prove the needful things, and that, and you don't imply, you directly say, 4 of the 8 positions will be in net savings. That's how you justify back to this board, and eventually whoever asks the questions, the public at large, be they legislature or otherwise, we've hired more people because we're saving X amount of dollars. And it literally, I think, needs to be that cut and dry, because if it gets any more nuanced, I think you're going to struggle.
Yep.
And as Mayor said, I'd struggle, I think anyone here would struggle supporting the additional staff just 'cause.
Yeah.
So.
I think the other additional, Tony, if I may, the other additional comments that were made as far as contracting between different entities, I think that's a very innovative approach, Mayor Mahoney, and these blue boxes indicate a need for a person to dedicate to that position, whether that position is contracted or through a member entity into the diversion authority, or if it's a diversion authority employee. I don't think it really matters. I think we could certainly do some of that rearranging.
I think the history in the past has been the county and the city very much watch this project, and each of us have an engineer on it doing it. You guys have one, and Moorhead has Bob on it, and Jason's on it for the county. And I think if you start to remove us a little bit from this, I think both entities get a little nervous, because we've basically kept our eye on every penny we spent, and Nathan has to justify if he does something or something's happening. I'm sure the same thing with Jason. But for us, it's been an advantage, I think, Joel, because you can just go to, somebody comes in angry into my office, and I call Nathan up and say, you know, here's the problem, what do you want to do about it? And if we move it, I understand. I mean, this new person could be available, but I think the history of the 2 entities is we very much want to be involved with it. So if we do that in a different subcontracting, we're not private contractors, we're public, but it's somebody in our respective departments. So to me, I mean, part of that has to be looked at. I know Mary, trusts Jason in many of our meetings, and there's value of having the same face out there a lot of times when we meet people, because they know who those people are and they trust those people. That's my only, if you bring a new rookie in from somewhere else, I think that sometimes sets up some distrust for a while that takes something to grow. And as John would say, we're going to start moving on this thing this next year with the P3 getting bid and us in full construction in 21. Just I don't want us to slip on that as far as what we have built and trust in people we have. But
well, let me just add a comment to that, because I think those were great discussion points. If you look on the organizational chart and look at the TAG and the technical advisory group, I've listed Nathan, Jason, and Bob, and Jason could really be, you know, also, you know, Matt Stamness in there as well. TAG is, under this proposed structure, TAG is going to continue to be the focal point of all of the technical decision making. So I'm not viewing these new engineers, these new engineering positions to take over anything that Jason or Nathan or Bob are doing for the project, representing either their specific entity or just representing the project in general. All technical decisions will continue to be made at TAG and continue to have those folks involved. I believe, and this could change, but I do believe that when we move into construction in 2021, there's going to be a massive amount of work that needs to be done on the public side, that I fear the positions that we have just with Nathan, Matt, Jason, and Bob, it's not enough. There's going to be above and beyond that. Because you're talking about daily communications with the P3 contractor, multiple Corps of Engineers projects going on, multiple in-town projects going on. There's a lot more moving parts than there was this year. So I don't think we can use a 2019 as a baseline for the amount of work that's going to be happening. I don't want to create any bigger of a structure than I actually need either. So I want to make sure that I'm meeting the need with the right amount of employees. But I do think there's some continued discussions that can be had about how TAG and how the member entity engineers that are currently involved. It's just it's a tricky thing. We're going from an existing structure that was implemented because there was a need to one of a more formalized structure where the diversion authority now, has an administration, and how does the previous structure fit into this new structure? So I think there's a lot of question marks still, Tim. I would agree with you. We need to talk about those, and we're probably not going to figure them out here today at the finance
Joel, could you
committee
take
meeting.
it to TAG and then bring Mike and Robert in on it and just have a
Let's,
discussion?
I
that?
want to close this here, and I get the final word. Joel and I visited about the budget, and, one of the points I made is we transition to staff, we reduce reliance on consultants. And I think it's important to recognize that we've empowered our leader, and we need to stand behind him and let him build a team and hold him accountable. And so from my vantage point, I want to see less reliant on consultants and, quite frankly, less reliance on Mr. Shockley, because that's the development of the organization as it moves forward. So it's incumbent on us to make sure he has the team. And as I look at Mr. Montpleasure and Mr. Costin, silver hair. And so it's important that, as this transition takes place, that, he needs to have people that are accountable to him and less reliance on the team. And I get the point where we were in the past, but we're moving forward in a whole different model. And so I'm more concerned about the organization and how we're structured and who we're holding accountable on the team, and reliance on the partners, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Benson and all the folks that have gotten us to this point. But it's up to him to move us forward and his team. And that's just my view of organizational behavior and organizational development. We can't operate with, continue to evolve as various players, but he has to have people that are accountable to him. And so that would be my take on this. But it'll be an evolution, for sure. Let's move on to the next agenda.
Okay. One other, sorry, Tony, I have a couple other things that fall under executive director report. I want to just mention travel and expense policy for the diversion authority. So that there isn't one currently. There is some historic precedence that indicates that member entities should cover their own travel and expense, and that goes back to 2012, and really hasn't been addressed since then. And so this issue I'm bringing up because it was something I ran into in a previous trip to DC, where I asked member entities to come along for strategic reasons and specific folks to come along, and I felt that the diversion authority should reimburse travel expenses to the member entities for the travel. This really, from a logical perspective, this makes a lot of sense because the current city administrators and city managers don't have the ability to foresee what travel expenses are going to be for entity members related to the diversion authority, whereas I have a much better handle on that and can determine, a yearly budget that I have for travel and expenses and reimbursement to member entities. So I'd like to throw out the issue and see if there's any discussion. What I would maybe recommend and request is that some sort of policy direction is given that I can implement. My recommendation would be that the diversion authority would reimburse member entities that are requested by the diversion authority to attend travel related to the diversion authority. So.
Rick?
Mr. Chair, that seems to make sense to me. I think, to change things midstream is a little bit difficult. If we're going to change that, I would suggest changing it with the 2020 budget. That'd be my thought. It makes sense to me. Now, the only thing there is, is everybody going to be as prudent with how many trips they decide to take because somebody else is footing the bill? I want to be very careful about that. When we talk about different member entities, and I'm not sure how you monitor that. That would be your job, Joel. So I'm thinking that's going to be a little more difficult. You think, because I'm well aware that some of the entities are a little hesitant to send people on some of these trips because they can't justify the cost that's coming out of their budget.
Right.
That little that item goes away with this change in policy if we make that. But I think it makes sense for the diversion authority to foot the bills for that.
I was on the impression it was always paid that way, Joel, so I'm glad you brought this up as an issue. And to me, the chair and this executive director should decide who they need in the room. And we found every time we've traveled to have the right mix of people works very well. This last trip was very successful because of that. But it makes no sense, we're putting money in sales tax in this all the time, that we don't, it's a function of the DA. You're not taking anybody to Washington unless you need them there. So I'd be very much in favor of instituting this as a policy, and if you want just a motion to move forward with writing up a policy that the board can approve, I would be in favor of that.
That would be great. Yeah.
Motion to request a policy be written?
Yeah.
Okay, I would second that motion, then, that we get some written policies.
I'm not used to making motions without seeing something in writing, but I guess we'll accept it. Is there discussion? Mike?
Is this for 2020 or current?
I would say, my second would be for 2020, so that we have a good starting point to move forward, but that's up to your motion.
Well, my question would be, were there any problems with last trip? Is more, because Moorhead didn't have it in its budget, was there a problem with Mayor Judd coming?
There was a question about it, which led to this
And
discussion.
it's presently not in his budget.
Right.
Yeah, so they came out of the goodness, I probably would say, for this year, starting this year.
Maybe it's two different things we're talking about. One, just making a motion to reimburse the trips that have been taken already, and then
Okay.
two, to create a policy for 2020 going forward.
I'm unclear as to what, I understand the discussion. I'm unclear as to what the discussion is, because I think the county, as the city, 2019 especially, has incurred significant travel costs that we've picked up, and not just this last trip. And so why this last trip's any more special than any of the other trips we've taken, but.
Yeah, I guess that's the question I have is, if you're gonna change it in 19, then do you go back and reimburse all the entities? And I think that's kind of a slippery slope, and I understand Mayor Judd's problem. I think, that's something that the city of Moorhead could adjust their budget for, to cover that, and starting.
Would you
in
be more comfortable just moving it for starting next year?
2020?
Okay. I'm fine.
You want to amend your motion, then? Okay, and I would second that we look for a policy for 2020.
I'll second that, or if it has been seconded.
You're third.
I'll third it, whatever. I'll vote for it.
Further discussion? Chuck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get back to this prudent number of trips. How many trips are we talking about?
Well, right
Would it
now,
depend on the situation, or?
yeah, so right now, just knowing what we know about the federal funding and what we need to do to continue to provide certainty and advocate for federal funding for the Corps, I've included 2 trips in my administrative budget before you in that letter as part of the operating costs. And I've assumed that we were going to make this change and move in this direction. So I would estimate 2 trips to DC for, 4 individuals from the different member entities over the course of 2020. I've also included some travel expenses for myself for the North Dakota Water Conference, some legislative lobbying, and a Red River Basin Commission Conference, those sorts of things. I don't know, I can't estimate what our needs are going to be necessarily in 2020, 2021 for trips to Bismarck, trips to St. Paul, those sorts of things. But I think it would be, we could put numbers in there for a budget with some assumptions. But if I'm struggling with it, you can recognize that it's extremely difficult for Cass County Administrator or the City of Moorhead Manager to have any clue what to put in their budget for travel expenses for their elected officials.
And I was wondering about the St. Paul trips and the Bismarck trips too.
It would just be an assumed number.
Okay.
Councilmember Hendrickson.
Thanks,
We'll
Joe.
take the roll.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Aye.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney?
Yep.
Mr. Grimberg?
Aye.
Okay,
I think for the
Mr.
expense drill, when you get a WIFIA fund of $550 million, John, that's been very successful. I mean, when we think back, Tony Grinberg wanted 300 more million from the feds, and we moved it to 750. We've had really fantastic results when we've gone now so lately. So, and I think Commissioner Grinberg is sometimes we have to go there twice a year. It's just the senator says, come, we need you, and you need to come before these people. So they know Fargo, they know Moorhead.
Absolutely.
And we need you to get into OMB. You had to be there in February. Okay, are we still on 5?
We're working on it. We're still on 5, Commissioner Grinberg. One additional item for number 5. The Finance Committee, we had talked last time a little bit about the diversion recreational plan. And so we've determined a potential course of action for the diversion rec plan and how that will be incorporated into the P3 arrangement. We are recommending that any grading or surface grading or anything related to the material prep, soil prep for the diversion channel related to the recreational plan be included in the base bid for the P3. And the reasoning there is that it's going to be much more costly to put those elements into place after the diversion channel is implemented, and it really costs nothing to have those items implemented if we prescribe it in the P3. Because it's moving dirt. They have to move dirt anyways. It's just a matter of grading it differently. There's extremely minimal, if zero, additional costs to including that in the base bid. But it would set the stage for paving a trail in the future or putting a parking lot in the future, and it would save expenses in actually implementing those pieces of infrastructure. The first alternate bid.
Joel, if without objection, I'd say let's move.
Okay.
So, I mean, we're getting.
I know.
We got a lot to do yet, and I'm not sure if people have a hard stop at 5, but unless you want to know more on this, let's move on.
Okay, sounds good, Tony. All right. All right, contracting actions for November 2019. I have one contracting action that needs to be approved by the Finance Committee and the Diversion Board. It's more than $150,000 that can be approved by the Executive Director. This is for permit compliance and monitoring. This should be in your packet. An item for approval and consideration.
Move to approve.
For a second? Discussion? Hearing none, we'll take the roll.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson? Yes. Ms. McCall?
Yes?
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Aye.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney?
Aye.
Mr. Grimberg?
Aye. Next.
Okay. For your information only, Executive Director approved contracting actions. One with a reduction of $166,000 for AECom. That was the closeout of a task order. The service agreement modifications for ditch cleaning for Nosted Brothers at $25,796. Cass County Joint Water Resource District approved contracting actions. This is again for informational purposes only. A task order amendment for property acquisition services for HMG for $660,000. There were no contracting actions for the Moorhead-Clay County Joint Powers Authority. And that's all I have for item number 6.
Questions? Before we move to 7? Proceed.
Okay. Item number 7 is the 2020 cash budget. I'll be going through here. So I have 3 columns indicated here. Forecast year 2018, 2019, and the proposed 2020 cash budget. I won't go in depth on these unless asked a question, but we'll just kind of go down the list there, and you can compare 2019 to the 2020 proposed budget. All of these items were information that were taken from member entities, the PMC, the Corps of Engineers, and incorporated into the proposed expenditures in 2020. The bottom line budget is $138,458,000. Any questions on the 2020 budget?
So the intent here is basically is their first look at it, come back in December and approve the budget. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
I recommend approval of the budget.
Yep.
Okay.
The enabling works slash other, you have 26,400. It looks like you've been spending more than that historically.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's enough?
I will defer to our PMC to answer that question.
That work includes a lot of the work that has been completed. So a lot of the enabling works and other work up to date that is basically in there as a line item to finalize and close out several smaller projects that will be completed. So there's really no new work in there, and that's why you see the reduction in budget there.
Okay, thank you.
Question, I'm not used to seeing small numbers.
On your screen, you can see the level 2 detail. So that would be, as Paul indicated, enabling work is at the bottom of this slide. Cass County Road 16 and 17. It's really just close out of that project. But you can see as I flip through here, we can provide all this information and dig down as deep as any committee member would like to dig to get the information that they feel appropriate for approval. There's an awful lot of information. Again, we did prepare, and we do have available for finance committee members the ability to do this on your own computers as well and drill down. As I previewed at the last board meeting, as far as how we're tracking our budgets and providing that information. So as you can imagine, it's a massive amount of information. We're not going to be able to dig into everything right here. But what I would hope is that as you're taking a look at the individual elements of the 2020 budget, that if you flag questions and contact me over the course of the next month before our next finance committee meeting, I can provide any information that any committee members would want to see.
Rick, then Mike.
Just a quick question. So where in the budget is the, I'll call it direct diversion authority expenses for management? Like your budget, the 990,000. Where do we find that in here?
So if you look up on the screen for level 2 summary, it'd be under the program management. You can see diversion authority operations. And if you move over into the 2020, you see 953, which is just a bit different than the letter.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Yep, okay.
Mike?
I guess the obvious question we're gonna be asked is where's the money gonna come from? So do we have a revenue budget that we're gonna present at the same time?
We do, and we can provide that to the committee as well. Yeah.
It's important.
I hope it's our sales tax.
Moving on. Everybody okay?
Got some cash on hand.
Okay, I'll have Mr. Shockley and present the flow of funds for WIFIA financing.
It's big sheets, come on. We live by 11 by 13. Legal brief.
something is too much.
It's too small, barely read it.
Big picture.
I like blue colors.
Green.
So, I know this is a big flow chart, so maybe I'll start at the beginning of why are we doing this? So as part of the P3 process and the WIFIA process, we have to flange up the financial flow of funds to how the debt instruments look and how the P3 project agreements look. And so, a little bit of introduction, this is bond council work. I do this all the time. We try to get into the flow of funds. This sheet represents the flow of funds for about $2 billion. And so I wanted to take some time, explain it, get your approval around it. The next steps are to go to the board, and then I'll be going to each of the member entities, because each member entity, as we'll go through, will be required to pass a pledge resolution. And then we're going to, through the next year, work on reaching closing on both the P3 contract and the WIFIA. And so it's a big tranche of work. There's a lot of work involved in it, a lot of structuring, a lot of legal agreements, and a lot of compliance. And so I wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page with regard to the flow of funds. And so I have a kind of a nice animation to walk through how this works, and it matches up to what's on your sheet. So just from a very, very basic level, the state of Minnesota is going to be giving appropriations through Minnesota DNR, and those appropriations are going to go directly to the MCC JPA board. They have a project fund that's being held by Clay County as the fiscal agent for the MCC JPA. And so currently those funds will not flow to the diversion, they will flow instead to the MCC JPA. As those funds flow through, any of the funds that are expended out of the MCC JPA will have conditions that attach to them that are normal Minnesota conditions, such as bond restricted property and other items. So there are regulatory reasons why we want to keep those funds separated from the diversion authority, and the MCC JPA seemed like the logical organization to do that. Our next big contribution is the state of North Dakota that will give its annual appropriations or through the bienniums. Those funds flow directly into the revenue fund of the diversion authority through the cost share agreement that the diversion authority has with the state of North Dakota. That is critical to identify those funds as they become part of the pledged, quote unquote, pledged revenues for the diversion authority and part of the repayment of the various obligations that we'll get into from the authority. The next is the sales taxes collected by both City of Fargo and Cass County. These are in total 1.75% sales tax. I'll be coming before the City of Fargo and the Cass County Commission to have those two entities pass a formal pledge resolution into the revenue fund of the diversion authority. That is part of the WIFIA financing and part of the P3. The next flow of funds, and this is if needed, is through the Cass County Joint Water Resource District. They have created an improvement district, and if you'll recall, that was just for a backstop. That's not actually for a flow of revenue. So you're going to see two different instruments coming out of the Cass County Joint Board. They're referred to as warrants, and warrants are attached to an appropriate level of special assessments. So we're really creating two warrants. We're creating a non-P3 warrant, and I've just used 350 as placeholders, and then a $450 million warrant. The $450 million warrant is never intended to be collected on. That was the policy direction of this board, and instead it would be paid by sales tax revenue. What that will be held for, and we'll get into that later, that will be held by a trustee as security for the P3 developer's equity contribution. And finally, there is a deficiency levy that attaches to any warrants that are issued by the Cass County Joint Board. That is levied by Cass County. That would only be needed in the event that the sales tax was insufficient, the warrants are insufficient, and basically that's the worst case scenario that could occur. On the maintenance side, we have the Cass County Joint Water Resource District Maintenance Levy, and then the Minnesota entities pursuant to the Joint Powers Agreement have pledged their contribution of stormwater fees for the operations and maintenance. Those funds will flow into an operations and maintenance fund. The operations and maintenance fund, as with the revenue fund, is already established in the Joint Powers Agreement that created the Diversion Authority. Those operations and maintenance are split into two items, P3 O&M and non-P3 O&M. When we receive bids for the P3 contract, you'll receive a bid that includes an availability payment for the capital contribution and an availability payment for the operations and maintenance. So we will know when we receive bids what the P3 O&M will be. Where do the funds go once they end up in the revenue fund? As the executive director was just briefly going through, they'll flow into the annual budget. And I like to think of it as in buckets. So it flows into the annual budget, and the first bucket that it fills up is the operating costs. That includes keeping the lights on, your staff costs, etc. During construction, the next bucket it flows into is your required debt service during construction. So that's currently going to be your interest only. And then into the Diversion Authority Project Fund. That's a big fund that Paul will get into. That's what you pay all of your bills out of. And then if there's anything left over at the end of the year, those get swept into net revenues. After construction, it's very similar. There'll be operating costs, net revenues, and then we have a separate fund called excess revenues, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Operations and maintenance for the non-P3 items after construction will flow into the operating costs. So where do these funds go? During required debt service during construction, it'll flow to a trustee. You may be asking, why do we have a trustee? We're dealing with a $2 billion project. The P3 world wants some assurance that they're going to get paid. Also, due to the complexity of the multiple payments, having a trustee in place is preferred. I reached out to the Bank of North Dakota after touching base with the finance members of the staff, and Bank of North Dakota has indicated that they're willing to serve as a trustee. I've utilized them in other complex transactions. They usually offer the lowest cost of trustee services. They're familiar with large transactions like this, and we're actually quite interested in serving on this project, and it's kind of nice to have the state involved in it because the state has said repeatedly that they would be interested in supporting it. Net revenues will also flow to the trustees, so if there's anything left after construction, which I believe that those during construction we're not anticipating anything would be left. After construction net revenues, that's what we're using to pay all of our debt service. That flows to the trustee. Assuming after construction is over, all the temporary financing is done. We then make our WIFIA payments and our SRF payments. You'll recall as part of our finance plan, we have a WIFIA loan and an SRF payment. So SRF comes after the WIFIA. So WIFIA is at the top of the waterfall. And the trustee will make the payments to WIFIA and SRF. And then the next payments out of the pledged revenues is the P3 fund. And that's the costs that actually are being made in your availability payments. That's when you're repaying the P3 proposer. And so the security, as we talked about, the P3 warrant, that goes into the P3 fund and is held in trust by the trustee. Also, after construction is complete, any of the P3 O&M costs will be swept into the P3 fund and held by the trustee, all to make payments under the project agreement that we're working on that we will close on if everything holds the schedule like we're hoping it will. That would be closing in either December of 2020 or January or February of 2021, right along the same time as the WIFIA loan. From there, there'll be certain reserve requirements for both the WIFIA, SRF, and potentially for the P3 fund, so the trustee would fill those buckets. And then if we have to issue any refunding improvement bonds, the sales tax would be used to pay that. Where do all those funds go from those loans? Those are loan bond proceeds, and those flow all into the project fund. So when we close the WIFIA fund, you draw it down, it goes into the project fund. What happens if there's excess revenues at the end of every month? And keep in mind the trustee is doing this every month. It flows into an excess fund revenues, and then it flows back to the authority into an excess revenue pot. And then the excess revenues are diverted into your operations and maintenance. The idea with the authority has always been that we want to use sales tax and revenue as much as we can without reliance on other funds to fund both the capital costs and the operations and maintenance costs. If there's additional excess revenues left over after operations and maintenance, it goes back into the revenue fund and you start the process over every month. This chart will be part of the WIFIA financing as part of the P3 financing, so it's in draft form. I wanted, because it is so technical and there's so many entities involved in it, I wanted to make sure that there was alignment from the finance committee and then the diversion board before I start going out to the member entities. We're dealing with a lot of money, and from a bond council perspective, I love doing this stuff, so I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Paul is going to get into where does the money go once it goes into the project fund. I would note the last item is to cover some of the local costs of the MCC JPA. There may be funds that come out of the FM project fund. So I'm going to pause and let you ask any questions you might have about this very complex chart. I encourage you, if you do have questions, please ask, because we're going to start introducing this to WIFIA and all of the players that are involved in this transaction.
Chad, then Tim.
What does our trustee cost?
They want to see a copy of our white paper, which is one of the items I'm working on, and then they're going to estimate what their cost for being a trustee is. So we don't have a precise cost yet. That's one of the items that we will be getting. My experience has been Bank of North Dakota is always the lowest cost trustee around.
Give me a guess, 1/4%, 1/8%?
It won't be that high.
Okay.
Usually on the other deals that I've used Bank of North Dakota, it's just been a monthly fee.
Okay, so relative to the amount of dollars coming in, it has to be relative to that, right?
Not necessarily.
Or is it just management fee regardless,
Yeah.
whether it's 10 million or 100 million?
Yeah, it depends upon the complexity of the instrument and what we're asking them to do. And then they'll quote us a fee.
Thank you.
John, I just saw on your WIFIA payment, I'm under the impression that WIFIA payments, are we making payments before the end? You have it as one of the first outstanding loans, or is that just the order you put in?
That's after construction. That's a great question. So with the WIFIA, our intent is to close in January of 2021. It's a drawdown loan, so it locks in at the interest rate that closes that day, and we don't start paying interest on it until 5 years after. Well, we pay interest on it, but it's capitalized, and we don't make our first payment until 5 years after construction. And
So on that slide, your SRF payment is actually the first payment from the state we'd have to be starting to pay right away?
Not necessarily. It's going to depend upon when those SRF loans are drawn, and some of those details still have to be worked out. You raise an interesting question, because during construction, we may also be utilizing, rather than straight revenue bonds that we currently have with Wells Fargo, there is an option where we can utilize the improvement district from Cass County Joint Board to issue lower cost temporary improvement bonds. And that would lower some of our capital costs and also lock in a temporary interest rate. And so after I got buy-in from everybody, I was going to meet with the Cass County Joint Board and make sure they were okay with this. I've reached out to their financial consultant, but I needed to get everybody's buy-in and make sure there's comfort level, because we're dealing with a large tranche of financing.
When you're done with all this, are you going to come, I mean, Ernst & Young has done an evaluation, and Martin, you've done that. It sounds to me on some of this stuff, you may have some additional savings that we might get on interest and or other parts of the project. Is that sometime at the end of some many months of study? Would you come back and tell us that, or?
Yeah, part of building a comprehensive, and so I will say that through the leadership of the Finance Committee, our direction has been to build a prudent and robust financial plan. And so as we've estimated interest rates, we've erred on the conservative side so that we can give the board a realistic view of what you can pay for and what you can't pay for. And so-
Conservative meaning high.
Yeah,
higher.
the interest rates
Yes.
have typically been slightly higher than what we've seen, not tremendously higher, but conservative estimates that you would normally use as a financial planner.
Further questions, comments? What do you need from us, John? You're going to share this tomorrow as well?
Yeah, and I just highlight that I just want to emphasize that over the next year and a half, there is going to be a tremendous amount of work associated with this and the WIFIA loan, just because it's such a large tranche of money, and there's so many different players that it will be a lot of work. And I'm going to, in your packet, I've included just a calendar of events for WIFIA, and you'll see that I'll keep populating that every month just so that you see we identify different items as they're completed in green. And so I can certainly answer any questions. I just want to keep the board informed of our progress on the WIFIA. We're moving right along. The executive director did mention that there are several federal requirements as part of the WIFIA loan. We provided, after researching all of the legal issues, we provided to the executive director and the PMC all of the federal requirements regarding the construction contracts. And there are also some other federal requirements regarding the professional services contracts. Nothing that's unreasonable or difficult to meet. It's some of your standard requirements that you'll see, such as American Iron, Davis-Bacon wage rates, and then there is a requirement to use good faith efforts to try to obtain DBE workforce, and the DBE workforce is based upon gender, kind of some gender goals, and all that is a requirement from a reporting requirement to show that each of the contractors has demonstrated good faith attempts to meet those requirements. They're not, it doesn't void it if they can't, they just have to show they've made good faith. And from a WIFIA standpoint, and reinforcing what the executive director is saying, from a WIFIA standpoint, each year after loan closing, EPA will make a visit to the authority to verify, number one, that the items that we're drawing the money down for are actually being built, and number two, to verify that we're keeping track of all the record requirements and the regulatory requirements. And they can ask up to once every quarter for a report on that. So there are regulatory requirements that we have to comply with in exchange for that lower cost of money. And just as an illustration of the current interest rate, if we were to close today, our current interest rate would be around 2.5%. But it's always subject to every different days, the rates go up and down for US Treasuries.
Rick?
Just along the same lines as Mr. Grunberg's question. So, John, you're going to present this tomorrow to the board, and is there an action you're expecting from the board? Is there a consensus? I mean, you're looking at a lot of stuff here, and are you looking, if you don't hear a lot of dissent, you're okay with it? What are you looking for? I mean, what I'm getting at is we're trying to, the Finance Committee should try to help move this along. Is there anything we can do, some type of a motion, some type of an action we can take to suggest to the board that we've looked at this and we recommend whatever it is you're looking for?
So with these complex financing transactions, what I like to do is preview what the formal action will be. In December, I'll be bringing forth a formal white paper for your approval. That's going to be approximately 50-some pages, including this chart and including how we're going to handle the transaction. And the chart really tells the story about the transaction. So my biggest, I don't have any requested action for you today. It's more of, do you have questions? Are you comfortable with how we're going to pursue this? If you do, please tell me, because next month I'll be bringing the formal requirements in.
Chairman, couldn't the chairman and the accountant look at those and just tell us so we don't have to read the 50 pages?
Keep the faith.
John, just a question. I see that you're talking about net revenues that will be coming, it would be going into the to the trustee? Is that on a monthly basis, you're saying? So if we draw in more, then we have to be requesting money from the trustee if we're like storing up for a few months and then we have a big bill, it's gotta come back from the trustee to cover that?
So you're right, it'll be monthly, and how I've structured it with the other trust indentures is at the end of every month, because most sales tax comes in North Dakota right around the 20th of each month. So at the end of every month, you send the net revenues to the trustee. For the first 10 days in the following month, the trustee appropriates 1/12 of the annual payment in each fund and sweeps it down through each of those funds, gets the excess funds, and then sweeps it back to the
So
authority.
you will have it coming back. You're gonna give it to them, they'll take 1/12 of what they need, and then they're gonna give it back so it's gonna be a pretty regular movement of monies.
Correct, and then the nice part about that is they cover any arbitrage or rebate requirements, they do the analysis, and they assure that you have the IRS compliance for any of the tax exempt issues. And given the size of this transaction, we need a trustee to do that because they're just such large numbers. And also the part of the P3 process, you'll recall back when the legislature said 750 rather than the 870, we wanted to provide some assurance to the P3 teams that your monthly invoice will actually get paid and there's actually a proper flow of funds to pay those.
But the payments will come out of the project fund? The trustee won't be making any payments. They'll give the money back to this group and then they make the payments, correct?
So, great question. During construction, the loan proceeds there'll be two forms of payment that are made to the P3 developer. During construction, they'll be referred to as what are called milestone payments. So for example, if the P3 developer has completed 30% of the work, they may come to a certain point at which they reach a milestone and they'll get paid 10% or 15% of the capital cost. It's always less than the work that's been advanced up to a certain amount, and that certain amount, we'll just say rough numbers, up to 600 million in milestone payments. The other 300, 400, 500 million, whatever the amount is in availability payments made over the remaining 30 years. The availability payments would be paid out of the P3 fund by the trustee after substantial completion. Good question.
Just as we're ready to move on, just a comment, just, following up from the mayor's point earlier, our discussion about the finance director. If this doesn't give you a perspective of the complexity and somebody understanding all the finances and not relying on Mike when he's retired in Arizona and Kent in a bear stand.
No,
I mean,
you're not.
I just would request you keep this document in mind as we continue to move forward with the adjustment of fewer consultants and staff and what's the right amount. You really like this, doing this stuff?
I do.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Okay, John has been focused on the revenues, and now we're going to start to look at a little bit in the expenditures. You can't really tie the two together. You can't really talk one without the other, so we've actually covered some of these items already. But again, we're trying to coordinate and to track the funds so that we can properly report for the various entities and where those funds are. Some of the projects, especially the P3 of that size, only portions of the projects are eligible for certain types of funds and certain type of loans, so we need to track through those. So along the top, and I've tried to mirror the spreadsheet or the organizational chart that John just handed out. So your incomes are in the green on the top, your annual budgets or your budgets are in the blue in the center, and then the outcomes or the expenditures are down at the bottom. So we're just going to walk through each one of those, kind of a quick trace as to where the funds come in and where we anticipate them going out. And as John stated earlier, the state of Minnesota will provide the MCC-JPA with funding there that both Minnesota lands will be purchased out of, and then any Clay County projects. The city of Moorhead has also applied for state of Minnesota funds, so those again will flow directly to the city of Moorhead for any lands that they need to purchase or any lands that need to be in their jurisdiction, and then also any of their in-town 37-foot projects that they'll be continuing to work on. This one gets a little bit more complex. This is the basically the annual budget that we'll be looking at and focusing on where the state of North Dakota funds come in, and then also the sales tax comes in. They come into the annual budget. Those will also be dispersed out of the annual budget to the MCC-JPA if there is a need for, in the timing of those. We cannot hold, we're anticipating not holding up the acquisition of land by supplementing some other supplementing through the MCC-JPA if needed. Same thing with the Cass County Joint Water Resource Districts. As they purchase lands, funds will be going out of the annual budget during construction to cover the purchase of lands as they continue on. There's also the administration section, and then during construction, it'll be, as we're operating now, the reimbursement of the Fargo projects, any Cass County projects that are going on in there. You see it also pointing to the P3, while the WIFIA and other funding sources will be a part of the P3. There will still need to be some sales tax and state of North Dakota funds that will be designated to the milestone payments along the way. Same thing, we also talked a little bit earlier about the short-term loan interest and repayment. According as built into our financial plan that we've looked at, that had the Wells Fargo loan paid off during construction. And so some of those funds will be going to pay off that short-term loan. Non-P3 maintenance, since construction is 5 to 6 years in length, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is currently out there constructing the diversion inlet. That will be complete and turned over to the Diversion Authority prior to the final completion of the project, the final per operations. So there will be needing during that time frame to do maintenance on portions of the project that have been turned over to the Diversion Authority. So that's what that bucket is down there.
Excuse me, can you explain just a moment, if you go back?
Sure.
How does the trustee fit in here?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
When you're, what flows to the trustee? If I understood John to say, he said when you get the sales tax revenue that it has to go to the trustee first and they'll take what they need and then give the rest of it back to us. I just don't see the flow going back and forth to the, maybe I'm misunderstanding.
It's a great question. During construction, there's a slightly different flow of funds. During construction, there'll be the only funds going to the trustee during construction are required debt service. And so this is all during construction.
So it'd be 1/12 every month of the debt service would go there, or?
Yeah, it will, we don't, if we used the current notes, it would be 1/12 of the required debt service would be shipped off to the trustee every month during construction. If we use improvement bonds, it may be 1/2 where they're payable 2 times a year. But the only thing during construction that's going to the trustee is just the required debt service. The trust indenture really doesn't kick in and the full, it doesn't spring forward until after construction is complete.
Okay, that makes more sense, thank you.
And so they, at the same time though, the trustee will be managing the various loan payments. And so the SRF loans, the short-term loans, and the EPA WIFIA will flow to the trustee. And then those will actually, as you go through, go into the FM Diversion Project Fund. That's when you will again see additional payouts to the P3. And then the additional lands, Fargo projects, Clay County projects, whatever we utilize the short-term loans for. And I'll actually step through these in a little bit more detail here, loan by loan, because we need to track them loan by loan since they have each have their individual unique requirements that we need to track them by. There's also, we included in here too, any other long-term bonds, and if the Army Corps WIFIA stands up, we want to be able to track those also in there, should those become available and we get those funds. So any of the SRF loans that come in, those will be going to portions of the P3, whether it's water, clean water, or drinking water portions. We can allocate some of those funds to the P3. The Fargo projects, there's stormwater pump stations. We're looking at getting the clean water loans for those. And then some of the North Dakota lands can also be acquired underneath that, those that are underlying the improvements for the clean water and drinking water type projects. Short-term loans that we have out there, or we could, that we have, those can be utilized in pretty much as we've been utilizing them today and going forward, so we can continue to utilize them in the projects as needed. EPA WIFIA, again, that will have to be into the P3 is the primary locator of that, but there's also a certain portion that can be utilized for lands, and then also some of the Fargo projects in that area. Now we jump to after substantial completion, so that we've jumped from construction to the operations and maintenance portion, which is kind of the blue corner on the lower left in John's diagram here. And so again, we'll see the sales tax revenue in the state of North Dakota, and this is where it goes to our initial administration, our operating costs, and then the net revenues go to the trustee. And the trustee will then pay the availability payments and pay the any long-term loan, and then the short-term loan, paying off the WIFIA type, the WIFIA loans and any short-term loans that we may have. The other side of that is the actual operations and maintenance itself. There will be Minnesota stormwater fees. There will be the maintenance levy that comes into the Cass County Water Resource District. And those will go to the operations and maintenance. Minnesota stormwater fees will need to track those to make, see for what maintenance operations we have on the Minnesota side. And then track those back to those stormwater fees there. It will go to both a non-P3 maintenance, which will include the southern embankment and the inlet structures and the control structures along the southern embankment. And then also the P3 will have their operations and maintenance work along the diversion channel. And then if necessary, if available, that's where the sales tax revenue will circle back around and make sure that we have enough to cover the operations and maintenance. So in a nutshell,
Questions?
that's where the money's gonna go, but we need to try and figure this out early on. It works hand in hand with what John is working on to secure the funds, but then we need to track and make sure that we can properly report where the funds go to.
Just had one quick question, and that's just because I haven't been here for the whole term of this project, which I don't know how many of you have, but
He is.
the Minnesota stormwater fees, is that coming from, where is that revenue coming from? Is it come from the city? From this, like the city of Moorhead is gonna be collecting stormwater fees and sending them here, or is it coming from the state? I'm not sure I understand.
So the stormwater fees are the Minnesota share of the operations and maintenance. That's the actual split of that between the county and the city still has to be determined. The county and the city will have to come to an agreement on how to split that. And that percentage of the operations and maintenance is set forth in the joint powers agreement, that split. So it's already set up. The only thing that remains is figuring out the percentage between the county and the
So we know how much is obligated to come back, we just don't know what the split is between who's picking up, okay.
Correct. When our original estimates, it would be about $80,000 to $100,000 a year from the stormwater maintenance fee to.
Combined, city, county combined?
Combined, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, where are we at on the agenda? We're still on
Items-
5B, or no, 7B?
No, 7C.
Yeah, that was just the update to the schedule, and then I have a resolution that I discussed last month regarding the WIFIA fees, and then also giving me authority to negotiate out all of the transactions. So what'll happen, I've already had several meetings with WIFIA. What happens next is we go through a process. We have a whole large amount of work to submit to them, from environmental compliance to contract compliance. Our application goes in February. Then we'll have a negotiation period with WIFIA. During that same time period, we are working through our PABS allocation, and then also any SRF loan issues, along with working through the trustees agreement. So that's that huge tranche of work that I've been talking about. This resolution authorizes me to go forward and get that done, and pay the WIFIA fees, which we've talked about. The application fee is about $100,000. WIFIA itself charges the issuer, the diversion authority. The fee is professional fees back, so those could be in the neighborhood of $200,000 to $500,000. And so our total application fee will be in the neighborhood of probably $500,000. And that doesn't include the expenses the authority incurs. So in exchange for that, you're saving a minimum of $600 million for the project and getting it paid off sooner.
So you need a motion for that? Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second, moved and seconded, discussion? Hearing none, motion to recommend to the full diversion authority board. Take the roll.
Mr. Montplaisir?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. McCall?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Aye.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Mr. Redlinger?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney?
Aye.
Mr. Grimberg?
Aye. Mr. Dodds has left, so if there's no objection, we'll incorporate the property status report tomorrow at the DA meeting. Just for full disclosure, I wasn't referencing at all that Mike Montplaisir is going to retire. I was just using him as an example. So I have no inside knowledge. He said nothing to me, Chad. I
Text
saw
Mike here
your-
after this meeting.
Oh. Next meeting, notes in the River Room, not here, on December 18th. Motion to adjourn,
Motion to adjourn, sir.
seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Aye, motion carried. Thank you.